You stand alone on the edge of a battlefield, the ground beneath you stained dark with the blood of countless fallen souls. The air is thick with the acrid smell of smoke and sweat, heavy enough to choke your lungs. Around you, the low rumble of marching feet vibrates through the earth like a slow, relentless heartbeat. Shadows flicker as torches burn against the gathering dusk, casting cruel light on faces hardened by war and fear. The sharp clang of metal biting into metal rings out, a brutal symphony of destruction that drowns out the cries of the wounded and the whispered prayers of the dying. Your skin prickles with cold sweat, though the day is blistering hot. Somewhere nearby, a soldier's scream cuts the air, a raw, broken sound that lingers and fades into silence. You feel the weight of 1,000 eyes watching, waiting, knowing this night will be soaked in carnage. Before you, the Roman legions move like an unstoppable tide, armor gleaming dully beneath the blood-red sky. Their weapons are not just tools, they are extensions of cruelty itself, designed to shatter bone and tear flesh with terrifying efficiency. These are instruments of pain, forged in fire and sharpened by centuries of conquest, each one telling a story soaked in agony. You glimpse a spear, its tip glinting wickedly, poised to pierce the heart of anyone who dares stand before it. Nearby, a sword's edge catches the fading light, short, brutal, made to stab deep and end life quickly. But this is only the beginning. There are horrors here that no words can fully capture, weapons so ruthless that survival feels like a miracle whispered by the gods. The ground beneath you pulses with the memory of endless battles fought and lost, of screams swallowed by dust and time. And as the shadows grow longer, you realize that what you see is only the surface of a dark legacy. A legacy of tools crafted not for mercy or honor, but for destruction so absolute it haunts the very soul of history. You do not yet know their names. You do not yet understand their power. But soon, you will. And when you do, you will see the true face of Roman warfare, merciless, relentless, and brutal beyond belief. The Roman legion was more than just an army, it was a living, breathing machine of discipline and precision. Each legion was a carefully forged unit of nearly 5,000 men, drilled to move as one, to fight as one, to die as one. Their power came not only from numbers, but from a ruthless system of training so relentless that only the strongest and most obedient survived. From dawn to dusk, young recruits were molded into warriors, their bodies hardened by endless drills, their minds sharpened to obey commands without hesitation. Every soldier carried not just weapons, but the weight of an empire on his shoulders. The tactics of the legion were ruthless and efficient. Formations like the testudo, a living shield wall of overlapping scuta, turned them into near-impenetrable fortresses on the move. Each soldier's weapon was chosen with deadly intent, shaped by centuries of brutal conflict, from desert sands to dense forests, each battlefield leaving its scar on Roman warfare. But these weapons were not born overnight. They evolved, refined through endless battles, through the cruel lessons taught by enemies both savage and cunning. The iron in their blades was carefully smelted, tempered with secret knowledge lost to time, crafted to strike with devastating force yet remain flexible enough to withstand the chaos of war. Some weapons bore marks of repair and reinforcement, others were discarded relics, discarded only when their deadly edge was lost. Beyond the polished swords and gleaming shields lay innovations few ever knew about. Weighted darts designed to fly faster than an eye could follow, pylons engineered to bend and ruin the shields they struck, and armor pieces that balanced protection with deadly offense. Roman smiths and engineers worked tirelessly, their craft honed to produce instruments of death that could turn the tide of battle in a single stroke. This was a military force obsessed with perfection, one that saw every detail as a matter of life and death. Each adaptation, each improvement, was born from necessity, the unyielding will to survive and conquer. If you're fascinated by the raw power and relentless ingenuity behind Rome's military dominance, you owe it to yourself to subscribe now. If not, tell us why in the comments. We're listening. Because history's brutal truths are not just stories, they are warnings. And turning away only leaves you in the dark. This evolution of weapons was not merely a tale of steel and fire, it was a story of survival carved in blood. Each tool, each sword, each spear, was forged with the knowledge that the next battle might be the last. The Roman military machine thrived on this edge, relentless in its pursuit of dominance, merciless in its execution. As we peel back the layers of this ancient war machine, you will come to see that Roman weapons were not just instruments, they were extensions of a dark will, a psychology of war that sought not only to kill but to instill fear, to crush resistance before it could even rise. The weapons were designed to haunt, to leave marks on bodies and souls alike. Soon, you will meet these brutal instruments, each with its own story of horror and survival, each a testament to the merciless art of Roman warfare. And through them, you will glimpse the shadowed heart of an empire built on blood and iron. You see it in the hands of a Roman soldier, not gleaming, not ornate, but brutal in its simplicity. A long wooden shaft, nearly 2 meters, weighted by a pyramidal iron tip. It is the pilum, and though it lacks the elegance of a finely crafted blade, its purpose is far more sinister. At first glance, it looks like a spear. But the pilum was never meant for duels or honor-bound thrusts. It was built to disrupt, to disarm, to strip away the last defense between man and death. When hurled in volleys, it rained from the sky like thunder without warning, silent until it struck, sudden as a vulture's descent. The magic, and the cruelty, lay in its twisted design. Behind the pointed head was a soft iron shank, deceptively fragile, designed not to pierce and kill, but to deform. When it struck a shield, it didn't simply puncture, it bent, hooked, clung like a leech. The enemy's shield became a liability, too heavy to carry, too warped to use. And in the few seconds it took to toss it aside, the Roman soldier was already upon them. There was no defense against it. A single pilum could break an entire defensive line, not by killing, but by leaving soldiers exposed, panicked, and blind. Some tried to pull them free. Others tried to fight on, encumbered, stumbling. All of them bled. But this wasn't just clever engineering. It was psychological warfare. The pilum didn't simply rob you of protection, it robbed you of confidence. You didn't just drop your shield. You dropped your certainty. You dropped the belief that you could survive. Even its metallurgy served the empire's cruelty. Roman blacksmiths carefully forged the iron to be just soft enough. It would pierce wood and bone with ease, and then bend like wax, making it useless to anyone who tried to return the favor. Reuse was impossible. Surrender was guaranteed. And yet, even among Romans, it was feared. In one account from a fractured unit stationed on the edge of Germania, a defector showed local tribes how to sabotage the pila. Sharpening the tip improperly, hardening the shank to keep it from bending. At first, the difference was small. But in battle, when the Roman line found its own weapons hurled back at them, still sharp, still lethal, the confusion turned to horror. That day, a Roman detachment was nearly wiped out not by foreign blades, but by their own genius turned against them. Still, at its peak, the pilum reigned supreme. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, Roman legions clashed with the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of spears and shields that had once terrified the world. The Romans didn't try to match them in formation. They waited, and then hurled their pila. Shield after shield was ruined, and the once impenetrable phalanx fell into chaos. The sword work that followed was a massacre. Not because the Romans were stronger, but because they had turned the enemy's defense into a death sentence. And so the pilum earned its place as one of the most terrifying tools in Rome's arsenal. Not for its elegance. Not even for its kill count. But because it shattered the most sacred illusion on any battlefield, that you could be safe behind your shield. This was not a weapon of war. It was a whisper of helplessness hurled through the air, reminding every soldier on the other side that protection was fleeting, and death was patient. And if you're still watching, gripped by the genius, the terror, the cold intent behind even this one weapon, then this is the moment. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Not for entertainment, but because stories like this were buried in the dirt of dead empires. And if you won't join us in digging them up, then tell us below. Why not? We're listening. So are the ghosts. You see it strapped to the soldier's side, sheathed in worn leather, its hilt polished by the sweat of countless hands. Modest in length, unremarkable at first glance. But make no mistake, this is no ordinary blade. This is the gladius. The soul of the Roman legionary. The final word in every argument carved into the soil of empire. It was born far from Rome. A weapon of Iberian tribes, perfected in the brutal street fighting of hill battles, where tight spaces made long swords clumsy and slow. Rome saw its efficiency, and as they often did, they stole it, then refined it. Standardized it. Mass-produced it. And then unleashed it on the world. The gladius wasn't built to swing. It wasn't meant to impress or intimidate. It was made to stab. Short, straight, and deadly. 20 inches of honed iron driven straight into flesh, designed to slip beneath ribs, punch through lungs, sever arteries, and silence screams. Swinging a sword was showy, unpredictable. But a thrust? A thrust was cold. Calculated. Mechanical. Roman soldiers trained for it obsessively. Not on dummies, but on wooden poles, pili, hardened to mimic the resistance of a human body. They were drilled to step forward, shield raised, then plunge the blade with such force and precision that the point would enter the soft gap beneath the ribcage and never need a second blow. There was no flourish. No waste. Just death delivered like clockwork. And the wounds it left behind, surgeons wrote of them in awe and horror. Clean entry points, nearly invisible. But inside? Ruined organs. Torn veins. Internal bleeding so massive a man could die without ever knowing where he was struck. Enemies didn't fall screaming. They fell gasping, choking on their own blood, staring into the sun as life drained in silence. The gladius was not a weapon of warriors. It was a weapon of butchers. Mass-produced for efficiency, for speed, for empire. To the Roman soldier, it was more than just a blade. It was his identity. His salvation. His constant companion. Gladius and scutum, sword and shield, like twin limbs, never apart. Many were buried with their swords, even after regulations forbade it. Some named them. Others spoke to them before battle like old friends. To be separated from one's gladius was to be naked, exiled from the deadly fraternity of war. And yet, this small blade carved through empires. At Cannae, it cut down over 50,000 in a single day. At Alesia, it drove into the flanks of Gauls too stunned to retreat. No Roman victory was ever won without its bite. And no Roman story was complete without its stain. It was never the most beautiful sword. Never the longest. But perhaps that was the point. The gladius was built to disappear quickly into the body of your enemy, and just as quickly, into history. And this is only the beginning. If you've made it this far, if your pulse quickens at the raw truth of what forged Rome, then ask yourself why you wouldn't subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Why miss out on the brutal truths that shaped the world? And if you still won't, don't just vanish. Say it in the comments. Why not? Why turn away now, when the blood is still warm? 5. You hear it before you see it. A sharp, mechanical snap, followed by silence, and then a scream. Not a scream of battle, but something higher, thinner, the sound a man makes when death arrives before he understands it. A heartbeat later, a body drops behind the front lines. No blade touched him. No spear was thrown. But a wooden shaft now juts from his chest, still trembling from the force of its arrival. This was not chaos. This was precision. Cold, deliberate, invisible. This was the Scorpio, Rome's silent killer. From a distance, it resembled a miniature siege engine. A wooden frame, thick with iron fittings, mounted on a swivel base. 2 bundles of tightly wound sinew or hair formed its core, twisted torsion springs, loaded with tension. A long arm, pulled back by a crank, held the bolt steady. And when released, it struck with terrifying velocity. The Romans called it a scorpio, the scorpion. A fitting name. It stung from the shadows. Small enough to be carried by 2 men, light enough to be mounted on walls, towers, or even wheeled carts. On the battlefield, it was positioned just behind the legion's front ranks, hidden behind shields or rubble. There it waited, still and patient, until an officer exposed himself, until a cavalryman reared his horse too high, until a priest lifted his hands to call for divine mercy, and then, it struck. Its bolts were not arrows. They were spikes. Thick, iron-tipped, and as long as a man's forearm. Some were designed to pierce flesh, others, armor, others still, to smash bones on impact. The Scorpio didn't just kill, it mutilated. Bones shattered. Limbs torn clean away. Bodies thrown to the ground as if by the hand of an angry god. But the weapon's true power wasn't in its mechanics. It was in its silence. You never saw it coming. There was no warning, no whistle in the air. Only the sudden, horrifying knowledge that you were exposed. And that somewhere, in the distance, someone was watching you die. In siege warfare, it became the great equalizer. Behind stone walls, Roman engineers would mount dozens, even hundreds, of scorpions. Defenders thought they were safe, until men began collapsing at random, their throats or eyes or ribs punched through with bolts that seemed to come from nowhere. Even the strongest enemy formations could crumble under the scorpion's sting. Morale broke. Men refused to advance. Priests begged their gods in panic. The presence of just a few scorpions on the battlefield could change everything, not through body counts, but through fear. It made every man feel watched. Vulnerable. Alone. And we know it wasn't just myth. In the sands of Syria, archaeologists uncovered fragments of Scorpio bolts still buried in ancient walls. In Britain, at the ruins of a Roman fort, grooves were found where scorpions had been mounted on rotating platforms, designed to sweep entire fields with deadly fire. These weren't rare weapons. They were mass-produced, shipped across the empire, built into the bones of Roman conquest like hidden fangs. The Scorpio didn't fight like a soldier. It didn't bleed or shout or charge. It waited. It measured. And it delivered death with a precision the ancient world had never seen. This wasn't glory. This wasn't honor. This was Rome engineering death at a distance, removing the last human trace from killing, one bolt at a time. You stand on the battlements, hands trembling, the taste of ash on your tongue. Below, the earth groans. It's not the march of feet this time, it's something deeper. A pressure in the bones. A creaking tension in the air, like the world itself is holding its breath. Then it comes. A shriek, not human. Not animal. A howl of twisted wood and iron muscle. And then, impact. The tower beside you vanishes in an explosion of stone and blood. That was a ballista. The Romans didn't invent it. But they perfected it. The ballista was not a siege weapon, it was a sentence. A crossbow grown monstrous, its limbs as long as a man is tall, powered by twin bundles of sinew twisted tighter than the strings of fate. When loaded, it looked almost elegant, a giant held in restraint. But when it fired, it was wrath incarnate. It hurled bolts the size of small trees. Hardened shafts tipped with iron, designed not just to kill, but to demolish. Walls. Gates. Formations. Flesh. There was no shield strong enough. No armor thick enough. At full draw, the force behind a single bolt could drive it through a cavalryman, his horse, and the soldier behind him. Sometimes, the bolts didn't stop. They were recovered buried deep in stone walls. Or worse, found lodged in the earth, still vibrating, from over 400 yards away. At the siege of Jerusalem, Roman ballistae were lined up like executioners. Thousands of Judean defenders watched as their walls were torn open piece by piece. There are accounts, eyewitness accounts, of men being pinned to the ground by the sheer force of the bolts, still alive as the weight of them crushed lungs and shattered spines. And when the survivors tried to flee deeper into the city, the Romans simply advanced the machines. Set them up again. Fired again. Until resistance became rubble. But it wasn't just brute force. The ballista was a symbol. It declared, your gods can't help you. Your walls won't save you. Your body is not yours anymore. Engineers accompanied every legion. Some of them were specialists in ballista construction, calculating range, angle, and torque with terrifying precision. These weren't wild machines. They were surgical instruments of terror. The soft groan before the release. The hiss of the bolt in flight. The sudden silence afterward, broken only by the sound of collapse. And then they reloaded. What makes it worse is how coldly efficient it all was. This wasn't madness. It wasn't chaos. It was policy. Rome didn't use the ballista to fight fair. They used it to make resistance look suicidal. To break the spirit of a city before a single soldier crossed the walls. Imagine standing there, watching the shadow of a bolt racing toward you, faster than your scream can rise. Knowing there's nowhere to run. No bargain to be made. Only Rome, watching from the hills. Measuring. Aiming. Firing. These war machines weren't just tools. They were messages. You are not safe. Not in your towers. Not in your temples. Not in your body. And this is only weapon number 7. So ask yourself, if these ancient engines of terror still haunt the ruins, what else is buried with them? If you're still with us and haven't subscribed, it's time to decide, are you really ready to keep going? If you are, subscribe now. If not, we challenge you, tell us in the comments why. Say it out loud. Because your silence? It speaks volumes. It gleamed under the arena sun. Scales of metal wrapped tight around flesh, jointed like a serpent's body, but forged to strike, not to slither. This was the manica. To the untrained eye, it looked ornamental, some crude Roman jewelry for the arm. But to those who stepped into the dirt of the Colosseum, or stood on the front lines in the choking heat of Germania, the manica was no decoration. It was the difference between keeping your sword arm, or watching it shatter beneath an enemy's blade. Constructed from overlapping iron plates riveted onto thick leather or chainmail backing, the manica protected the forearm from wrist to elbow, sometimes even up to the shoulder. It was flexible, like a second skin of metal, but rigid where it needed to be. Unlike the broad shields or cumbersome full-body armor, this was crafted for precision, mobility, and punishment. You see, the Romans understood something savage and intimate. The arm is the path to the kill. Cut the limb, and the man is finished. Defend it, and the kill remains yours. In the gladiator pits, where style and spectacle reigned, the manica became iconic, seen on mirmillos, secutors, and other heavily armed classes. It turned swordplay into something colder. More surgical. Opponents aimed for the arm. They always did. It was human instinct. But every strike that clanged off that armored shell was a wasted breath. A moment lost. A life gone. Some gladiators, those with a taste for cruelty, used it as a weapon itself. In the chaos of a clinch, they would drive the edge of the manica into their opponent's jaw, temple, or spine. A twisting, hammering motion. Brutal. Efficient. There are scattered reports of manica strikes shattering ribs, caving in eye sockets. You won't find those stories on polished marble reliefs. But they're in the bones we've dug up, fractured in ways no sword alone could cause. On the battlefield, it adapted again. Legionaries in high-risk zones, especially cavalry and auxiliary forces, sometimes wore the manica in conjunction with their scutum. The enemy might parry the gladius, but when the arm came swinging in, reinforced with tempered iron, bones cracked. Joints failed. Fingers snapped like twigs. And still, it was rare. Unlike the standardized helmets or shields, the manica was personal. It wasn't issued. It was earned. Crafted to fit the warrior's arm. One curve. One limb. One killer. Its scarcity only added to its myth. A soldier wearing it stood out, not just as protected, but as dangerous. Other ancient cultures had bracers, yes. The Persians. The Greeks. But none leaned into the psychology of it like Rome did. To the Romans, armor wasn't just defense, it was domination. It didn't say, "Don't hurt me." It whispered, "Try. And fail." Think of the manica as a handshake from the past, with a clenched iron fist. And we're not done. This is weapon number 6. Just past halfway. And if you're still watching, still absorbing every dark, twisted detail of how Rome forged pain into policy, then you've already proven something. So don't stop now. But if you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself, why? You've made it this far into the armory of hell, why walk away now? They were silent until they weren't. Small. Easily hidden. Almost laughable at first glance, just a wooden dart, tipped with iron, weighted with a lump of lead. But in the still before a charge, when a Roman formation took aim with their plumbati, laughter died in the throat. Each soldier carried 5, sometimes more, tucked behind the curve of their scutum, the Roman shield, out of sight until the last moment. Light enough to throw overhand, but heavy enough to arc through the air with punishing velocity, the plumata was Rome's version of raining death. And they didn't throw one. They threw hundreds. In waves. Picture this, a barbarian line rushing forward. Roaring, fueled by fury and momentum, and then, like a swarm of black-winged insects, the darts descend. Not from artillery. Not from machines. But from the very hands of the legionnaires about to meet them in the crush. Each dart spun with vicious stability. The lead weight, strategically placed near the iron tip, made sure of that. The result? A high, arching flight that crashed down with enough force to pierce flesh, snap bone, and shatter morale. Unlike arrows, these weren't meant for sniping. They were meant to maim. A plumata to the leg could end a warrior's charge. One to the shoulder could drop a shield. One to the neck. Well, there's no coming back from that. And here's the cruelest twist, they often weren't even meant to kill. Rome didn't always want its enemies dead immediately. Wounded men screamed. They panicked. They slowed the advance. They pulled attention away from the fight. The Romans understood that a maimed army is more chaotic than a dead one. And the plumata was perfect for sowing that chaos. Archaeologists have found caches of these darts buried beneath ancient forts, bundles of them, bound together like firewood. Some still have traces of the original wooden shafts. Others, just the rusted iron points. But together, they tell the same story. When the legions marched, they brought the storm with them. And the psychological toll? Imagine watching the sky darken, not with clouds, but with sharpened iron. Imagine surviving the volley, only to realize your comrade beside you is choking on his own blood, and the enemy hasn't even touched him yet. This was the Roman way. Break them before you touch them. Shatter their minds, then their bones. And remember, the plumata wasn't reserved for elite troops. This wasn't the signature of an elite assassin. No. It was standard issue. Every Roman infantryman, regardless of rank or origin, had access to this cruelty. That means the terror came from everyone. This is the part of history they don't teach. Not because it's forgotten, but because it's uncomfortable. Because it reveals that ancient warfare wasn't heroic, it was calculated psychological domination. You've made it halfway through this list. If you've come this far, it's because something inside you wants to know how power really worked. Not in marble halls, but in screams and shattered spears. So let's not pretend. If you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself, what are you waiting for? This channel is one of the last places where brutal, unfiltered truth gets laid bare, without apology, without censorship. So go ahead. Hit subscribe. And if you choose not to, comment below. Tell us why. We won't stop you. But history is watching. They called it the asta, a simple name for a weapon that, in practice, was anything but simple. Over 2 meters of hardwood shaft, tipped with a lethal iron spearhead. No gimmicks. No thrown arc. Just pure, relentless thrust. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to puncture, stab, and tear, over and over again. The asta was the original Roman killing tool, used before the gladius gained fame, and long after the empire shifted its tactics. It was a weapon of endurance, of discipline, and of brutal repetition. In tightly packed formations, legionaries formed a living wall of death, each man armed not just with one point of contact, but with dozens. The spears protruded like fangs from the front line, and when they advanced, it was as if a machine of iron and flesh rolled forward. One asta strike didn't always kill. But 2? 3? There was no walking away. And the tip, don't overlook the tip. Some variants featured broad leaf-shaped blades. Others ended in long, narrow points designed to slip between ribs, around shields, and into throats. Some even had jagged barbs, not to kill faster, but to make removal impossible without tearing chunks of flesh along with it. This wasn't just about winning. It was about unmaking an enemy. Imagine standing across from a Roman line, knowing they wouldn't hurl javelins and then wait. No. They would advance. They would thrust. And if your shield dropped, even for a second, they would not stop. They would jab, not wildly, but with mechanical rhythm. In. Twist. Pull. Again. The sound of asta warfare wasn't the clash of swords, it was the wet crunch of iron into meat. The choke of breath as a lung collapsed. The gasp of confusion as the dying realized they had no time to process their death. There are recorded moments, legends, perhaps, but eerily consistent, where men impaled on multiple hastae continued fighting, not realizing how deeply they'd been struck. The weapon was efficient, and cruel. It didn't always kill instantly. That was part of its terror. In the Battle of Zama, as Hannibal's war elephants thundered forward, Roman front lines adjusted, not with fear, but with a grid of leveled hastae. They formed a forest of iron. And when the elephants fell, they became traps of flesh and bone, tripping the enemy's second wave into a wall of stabbing spears. This was psychological warfare. And it wasn't just in mass formations. In duels, gladiators or foot soldiers, the asta was used to probe, to feint, and then strike deep when the opponent blinked. It was the thinking man's weapon. Controlled. Ruthless. Clinical. It's easy to idolize ancient warriors as noble. To forget that they fought not with honor, but with efficiency honed through generations of bloodshed. Rome perfected the art of making death systematic. And the asta? It was the assembly line. By the time the gladius took over the spotlight, the asta had already reshaped warfare across Europe. Its simplicity meant it was copied, feared, and buried with the dead, often still stained with the lives it took. And now, ask yourself. How many documentaries have ever told you about this? How many channels treat war as more than dates and names? We bring you the weapons that weren't just tools, but messages. Iron letters written in blood. If you've stayed with us this far, it means something inside you wants more than sanitized history. You want truth, no matter how jagged it feels in the throat. So here's the truth, the asta wasn't just a spear. It was Rome's handshake to the world, an introduction through pain. And if you haven't subscribed yet, let me ask this, why look away now? Click subscribe. Not for us. For every name history left out, every soul impaled and forgotten. And if you still won't? Tell us why in the comments. But remember, Rome never forgot a name. And neither do we. It looked like a tool, because it was one. But the delabra was also something far darker. To the untrained eye, it resembled a simple pickaxe. A humble implement carried by Roman engineers. One end was a chisel. The other, a curved spike. It cleared rocks. Cut trenches. Dug graves. And when needed, it split skulls like firewood. That duality made the delabra one of Rome's most unsettling weapons, because it didn't belong to warriors. It belonged to workers, and yet, it bled just as efficiently as any sword. In the Roman legions, soldiers weren't just trained to fight, they were trained to build roads, camps, fortifications. The delabra was standard issue for this reason. But during chaotic ambushes, when shields cracked and formations broke, the delabra wasn't discarded. It was gripped tighter. Because nothing strikes fear into the enemy like a builder who fights with his own tools. There are battle accounts, obscure but persistent, where delabra-wielding engineers turned the tide. At the siege of Numantia, Roman support troops were overrun. But the enemy didn't expect resistance from diggers. What they met were delabras swung like hammers of the gods, spikes driven into ribcages, chisel ends crushing cheekbones. The invaders faltered. Not because they were outnumbered, but because they were psychologically shattered. There's something uniquely disturbing about watching a man swing a pickaxe, not with desperation, but with purpose. No style. No elegance. Just raw, bone-splintering necessity. And Rome understood that. They leaned into it. The delabra's design was refined over time, not just for efficiency in digging, but for balance in killing. The metal was heat-treated to resist cracking under repetitive impact. The wood, usually ash or oak, was curved to optimize leverage during strikes. Roman military records even noted weight preferences for different terrain, lighter delabri for mountain campaigns, heavier ones for siege assaults. That's right, siege assaults. When storming enemy walls, legionaries sometimes discarded their gladii in favor of delabri. Not out of panic, but because the tool could both open doors and open bodies. Break down a barricade, then break a soldier behind it. All in one motion. That's not strategy. That's ritualized brutality. And think about what it means, when your empire is so accustomed to warfare that it builds everyday items with the expectation they'll one day be used to kill. The delabra was never ceremonial. There were no engravings, no ornamentation. Just iron. Wood. And the weight of intentional violence. It teaches us something Rome never said out loud: their tools were weapons because their world didn't separate the two. Work and war, labor and blood, these weren't different categories. They were steps in the same process, empire building, corpse by corpse. And if you're still watching this, still absorbing every disturbing truth from the underbelly of Roman warfare, then maybe you're ready to accept that history wasn't made by generals alone. It was built, and destroyed, by men with shovels, hammers, and yes, delabri. You won't find this story in schoolbooks. You won't hear it in feel-good documentaries. Only here. Where we dig through the filth, the fear, and the forgotten tools of death. The spada, the long sword for cavalry brutality. It was longer, heavier, meaner. And it marked the death of the old Roman fighting style. The spada wasn't born in the heart of Rome, it came from the provinces. From the fringes. From Celtic and Germanic hands. But Rome, ever the opportunist, saw its potential, and stole it. Refined it. Weaponized it for the thunder of hooves and the chaos of cavalry charges. Where the gladius was precise, short, and surgical, perfect for tight formation stabbing, the spada was something else entirely. It was a sword built for chaos. Roughly 70 to 100 centimeters in length, the spada gave its wielder reach, crucial when you're mounted and swinging downward at a sea of enemy flesh. Gladii couldn't do that. They were too short, too stubby, too Roman. The spada? It could hack a man in half at full gallop. And it did. The rise of the spada signaled a shift, not just in tactics, but in psychology. Rome was adapting to new enemies, new terrains, new wars. Cavalry was no longer just for skirmishing or flanking. It was for breaking lines, cracking bones, and sending the enemy into full-blown panic. The spada made that panic possible. Archaeological finds confirm just how widespread and brutal this blade became. In northern Britain, rusted spada hilts have been found alongside the shattered remains of opposing swords, wooden grips split from sheer force. In the Syrian deserts, tombs of Roman cavalrymen include spathi still resting across their armored chests, long and heavy as iron shadows. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They were tools of grinding violence, evolved for slashing instead of stabbing, for disfiguring instead of disabling. And the men who wielded them? Monsters on horseback. Take Publius Flavius Vegetius Renatus. He didn't fight with one, but he documented how it should be used, with a wide arc, into necks and thighs. To hobble, not kill immediately. Let the enemy scream. Let them watch the cavalry loop back to finish the job. Because that was the spatha's true power. It wasn't about elegance. It was about prolonging the collapse of a man's will. Unlike the tight, disciplined stabbing of the legionnaire, the cavalryman with a spada didn't need rules. He didn't need formation. He needed speed, an angle, and permission to unleash hell. And the blade obeyed. Bronze-tipped variants existed for piercing armor. Heavier iron cores were forged for breaking shields. Handles were wrapped in boiled leather, so blood wouldn't make them slip. This wasn't artistry. This was functional cruelty. Measured in inches. Weighted in lives. The spada outlived the gladius. Even as the Roman Empire crumbled, the sword remained. It became the grandfather of the medieval longsword. Passed down through bloodlines of violence. Carried by Visigoths, Franks, Byzantines. Each adapting the design. But never abandoning the purpose. To cut deeper. To kill faster. To leave a longer trail of ruin. And that's what makes the spada so unnerving. It was a Roman weapon, built from non-Roman fear. Perfected through centuries of conquest, and resurrected by the very people Rome once tried to destroy. Still here? Then you're starting to understand. These weapons weren't just tools, they were statements. About power. About dominance. About turning men into messengers of terror on the battlefield. And we're not done. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next weapon is colder, crueler, and quieter. The kind that doesn't shout as it kills. And if you're not with us yet, ask yourself why. Why watch history from the edge, when you could ride into it, blade in hand? It was a wall. A door. A weapon. And for the enemies of Rome, the scutum was the last thing they saw before their bones snapped. We often imagine shields as passive, as something you hide behind. But the Roman scutum was never built for cowards. It wasn't just a barrier. It was a blunt force instrument of control. And when raised in formation, it became something worse. A marching fortress with a heartbeat. Standing over 4 feet tall, curved to wrap around the body, and built from layers of wood, leather, and raw ambition, the scutum wasn't delicate. It wasn't graceful. It was heavy, brutal, and deliberately oversized, for one reason: domination. Now imagine this: you're standing in a fogged-out field. You hear the stomp before you see them. Then, click. You realize it isn't just marching. It's the synchronized drum of 1,000 shields moving as one. A rippling wall of red and iron, growing larger, louder, closer. And when that wall hits you, it doesn't stop. Roman soldiers didn't use the scutum to block. They used it to shove, bash, and crush. The edge? Reinforced with iron. The boss in the center? A heavy, domed metal bulge made for punching, not defense. Soldiers would lunge forward not with the sword first, but with the shield. Ribs shattered. Noses caved in. Lungs collapsed. This wasn't defense. This was weaponized geometry. In tight formation, testudo, or the tortoise. The scutum made Rome invulnerable. From above, below, front, flank, no gaps, no fear. But when broken out of formation, the scutum could be personal. A soldier could hook, trip, slam, and smother. There are recorded cases of men being pressed into the dirt and stomped, unable to move under the sheer force of one man's shield. Even the shape had a message. That gentle curve? It meant force was concentrated at the center, magnifying impact during a charge. It funneled the blow like a fist-shaped ram. And in cities under siege, the scutum became the battering ram of the foot soldier. Kick down a door. Smash an archer's stance. Pin a fleeing rebel against a wall, then let the gladius finish the prayer. But it wasn't just physical. There was a psychological terror behind the scutum, like the grin of a monster made of order and steel. Imagine being a tribal warrior with a wooden axe, facing down a wall of these things. You don't see faces. Just iron domes. Red paint. Screaming silence. You don't fight individuals. You fight an idea. An idea shaped like a rectangle, moving in sync, with the force of empire behind it. In Germania, in Judea, in Britannia, entire revolts collapsed under the advance of shields alone. Not arrows. Not fire. Just pressure. Just fear. Just a wall of men who refused to break. Because when you gave a Roman legionary a scutum, you didn't give him protection. You gave him permission. To dominate. To press forward no matter what. To become a cog in a violent machine. Archaeologists have uncovered scutum fragments with dents, blood residue, and fractures that suggest offensive use was routine. These weren't pristine. They were wrecked. Because Roman warfare was meant to wear you down, mentally, physically, spiritually. And still, the enemy couldn't look away. Because the scutum wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a message. That Rome was coming. That Rome didn't flinch. That you were already losing, even before the fight began. And now you've seen it all. From fire-laced catapults to crucifixion tools, from poison darts to swords soaked in galloping death, you've just walked through Rome's darkest closet of war. So I'll ask you one last time. If you're not subscribed to Disturbing Tale by now, why not? We dig through the brutal truths they don't teach in schools. We unearth the secrets buried under empire, under ruin, under shame. And if you choose to turn away, we respect that. But at least tell us why. Drop a comment. Let us know what kept you from diving deeper. Because history remembers the silence. And so do we.